The title of my talk is The National Education Service, What's Not to Like. Labour's proposals around the National Education Service have much within them that will appeal to a wide range of stakeholders and address some of the concerns that those stakeholders have been raising. But below the proposals and in the process of turning them into reality, there will be some significant issues that will need to be addressed. And those are the issues that I seek to draw out in my talk. You know, when I first came up with a title, the title was, What is there not to like? Well, when you look at the headlines, that might be the case, but I first think it will be useful to explain what is it? What is the National Education Service? What are the proposals? Then to pick out those positives, the things, the sticker items that on the face of it look to be solving, in not least the problem I identified by the inequalities of ages and sort of phases of education within our funding system, but then some issues that present themselves. Now, your other talks might approach this in a different manner. Clearly, with my background, I'm going to concentrate more on post-16 education than the early years, but I will pick out what the proposals are in those earlier years. It's actually harder than you think to work out what the proposals actually are. And I've heard the headlines, seen the headlines, read bits and pieces in magazines, but trying to go back to first sources, I kind of today, and it was only today, went through 3 particular sources. One was set speeches that the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, has made, looked at the manifesto for the election, and then finally looked at the latest evolution of thinking around this, which is the charter which the Shadow Secretary for Education, Ms. Rayner, put out a few weeks ago. So looking at those successively, the speeches that I've gone back to look at was firstly the leadership contest in 2015, the speeches he made at that time, the election in spring 2017, and most latterly I was at my former organisation's, the Association of Colleges annual conference, at which Jeremy Corbyn spoke, and I've drawn from each of those to try and get some sense around what he means by the National Education Service. Actually, those are the kind of headlines. The ones that most people's attention goes to are scrap fees, universal free childcare, redress the cuts in FE. My attention obviously goes in that regard, in that direction. Lifelong learning, funded. Actually, as I'll see later, the only direct funding commitment I could find about identifying where the income to fund the proposals would come from is a 2% addition to corporation tax, a commitment to high quality apprenticeships, and a strategic coordinating role in a modern economy. Actually, you know, those are the 2 that I would identify as the most significant and will steer action, the ones that are consistent throughout. The specifics are very interesting to particular sections and groups, and they'll find within the strategy that which they like and appeals to their particular interest and their stage within education. But of those 2 that I'll come back to later as being particularly important, the first saying that education is a collective good as well as an individual benefit, which moves it beyond arguably about the much hackneyed phrase, a neoliberal approach to education. The people in the Institute of Education will be hugely amused that I use the neoliberal term, because I hate it when anyone else uses it, because it's normally an excuse for slack and lazy thinking, and it's an omnibus insult from anybody who wants to worry about somebody who wants to worry about money and resources and where they might come from. But nonetheless, it's that movement away from a marketized individual good, which the individual contributes to, makes choices within, that there is a collective good coming from education to which we all ought to contribute. And a strategic coordinating role in a modern economy, the state taking a more activist role in relation to education. In the manifesto is the first point at which you actually talk a national education service, and I don't know if the words cradle to grave, but subsequently, John mentioned, that came out of the press coverage of that, more than actually I think in the manifesto itself. But the thought about having a unified national education service, which I'll kind of point to some difficulties in enacting, not least because of the fact, you know, if I wanted to get there, would I have started from where I am now? And also question whether or not, in the complexity of the England, there's also an interesting point, education is a devolved matter for the 4 nations. So it's not possible, I don't believe, to have a national education service that covers all 4 nations, because that pass has already been made to the devolved countries, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. This will be an English national education service, perforce, unless devolution agreements are reversed. But there is a difficulty in how you manage complex systems. And we haven't done a whole system reform in our country so far as I can remember. In fact, that's actually the closest to that was when I was the last year in Hampshire to do the 11 plus, when we moved away from grammar schools to a comprehensive system. That's as close as I think I can remember to a whole system reform moment that we've been through. No one's, perhaps if you drag it all the way back to 1944 to the Education Act, is the last time we sought to do that. And I don't know if we're capable of, or it's capable of being doing, reforming a whole national education service in a once-off move. In terms of the specific years, the early years proposals are there. Overall, overhaul the childcare system. Interestingly, the maintained commitments to free hours, so building on what the coalition was doing or had done. Secure places for all, phase in subsidised top-ups in addition to free hours, so building on top of the free hours for particularly disadvantaged or young families who need more support or want to seek more support. Transition to a graduate-led workforce. Interesting distinction there, that's not all graduate workforce in early years, it's a graduate-led workforce. Extend 30 hours to all 2-year-olds, childcare for 1-year-olds, and extend maternity pay for 12 months. It's quite strange to have a national education service, maternity pay spoken about, but nonetheless, manifestos, and I've seen people put manifestos together, sometimes hard to know where to put the proposals in and which heading to put it under. Schools, fairer funding formula, but so again, building on the current direction of travel with the government towards a single national funding formula, but the critical point made within the manifesto with sufficient funding so that no school is worse off at the end of the move to an equalised funding formula across the country. The comments on quality are interesting, based on best practice, trusting teachers, and on collaboration between institutions, which is a very different approach to the current governments. But again, as I'll come back to later, collaboration and cooperation have other sides to them, which will be interesting to consider. Accountability, schools democratically accountable and serve public interest and local communities, for which you might say reduce the reliance on academy chains and the centralised control of the education system from the Department for Education through those chains, but not coming outrightly to say we're going to do away with academies. And inclusion, close the attainment gap. The latter one I think is also substantially to the fore in current government thinking as well. In terms of FE skills and adult education, I mean, interesting first reflection in the way that the chapters in the manifesto are broken down. They identify further education as being separate from skills and separate from adult education, which is, you know, I don't think that's necessarily that significant, but it does see a kind of and also apprenticeships seen as separate to those as well. Which, you know, whilst we like the idea of an end-to-end, they seem to be breaking up the bits in that end-to-end into even smaller bits. I mean, 16 to 18 to be equalised with 11 to 16, for which I cannot see any justification for not doing when you stand back and look at the system. And it's also welcome in this regard to see funding as a continuum. There's the papers point to a solid amount of evidence to say that early years has the greatest return on investment in education. but it's fallacious if you invest in early but don't invest in the end. You don't reap the benefits of your investment at the earlier stages. So have a continuous level of investment which begins to build one on another all the way through. It seems sensible to do. Restore the education maintenance allowance. Interesting only insofar as, well, interesting insofar as the EMA was intended to underwrite, when first introduced, amongst other things, full participation up to the age of 18 and to encourage young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds to remain in education through to completion of 18. With the raising of the participation age to 18 early in the coalition years, EMA was removed, and participation rates have continued to rise. You might therefore argue that EMA was not necessary in order to promote greater participation. Counter arguments could be that youth unemployment increased in that period, so more young people were inclined to stay on an education to age 18, and they did so against a background of being harder to reconcile their resource needs and their income. But nonetheless, education maintenance allowance is not hugely remarked upon when I talk to colleges as a barrier, or its absence as a barrier to learning. But nonetheless, the need was seen to actually restore it. Replace adult learner loans. I don't know if many of you are aware, much of adult education, which previously was free to adults to access, has now been turned over to adult learner loans. Initially that was done for all adults over 25. Adult learners loans have now been extended down to age 18 for those students who have not got a first level 2 or 3 qualification. So if you already have your A-levels, in order to do further studies in adult, if it's another level 2 or level 3 or further study, you now would have to take an adult learner loan out, and you could do that on the same terms pretty much as higher education loans, income contingent, and up to a set level for particular courses. There's remarks in the manifesto: drive up quality by increased cooperation, teaching qualifications for all FE staff. This same issue about cooperation between institutions rather than the competitive, marketised approach. Teacher training for private training providers is an interesting one there. It says something like, recognising the role of private training providers, we should invest in teaching training for them, which I find somewhat anomalous insofar as these are for-profit organisations for which the government is going to pay those employers for the training of their staff in order to generate profit. So I have difficulty in working that one out, and always have had. And capital investment to deliver T-levels, the new T-levels. For those who have not followed this, T-levels intended to be a technical education level equivalent to A-levels, but still working through what the content will be, the teaching methodology and the requirements of those new qualifications. And extend T-levels beyond technical areas, the 15 routes that government have identified as being suitable for technical education, to service sectors, so to retail and other areas of the economy, which is problematic when you begin to talk about what T-levels should contain, what the level of education will be within them, and if they will be reserved to an A-level type level rather than being at lower levels of qualifications. In apprenticeships, maintain the levy, but allow employers more flexibility, and don't apply the levy to schools. And I'll come back to, presently, any employer under the levy who has a pay bill of over 3 million is required to pay 0.5% of their pay bill into an apprenticeship levy, which they then can access vouchers for in order to provide training to their staff. So it's a means by which employers are encouraged to invest in apprenticeships, but they can only be used for apprenticeships, and they're only apprenticeship standards approved by government in order to reclaim your contribution to the levy. They're talking about allowing employers more flexibility to use that. I suppose that is on other training products, other forms of work-based learning, or in using it perhaps to, if you're in a supply chain, to apply to people who are in your supply chain as an employer. You want to upskill so you can pass it on to someone else. You can almost trade in the levy vouchers that you'll receive. And that don't apply to schools is you know, I really, again, it's difficult to follow the logic around this apart from schools bemoaning the fact they're having to pay the levy like any other employer, and there aren't any apprenticeship standards yet for them to use for teacher training. It's a little bit of a chicken egg. If there are no standards, it's difficult to spend it, but that doesn't preclude you perhaps approaching teacher education as a higher apprenticeship or a degree apprenticeship. Trade union representation governance. There's £440 million for small and medium enterprises that don't pay the levy, and there's a concern actually the levy will be used as money to underwrite that funding, and the government avoid having to commit money in a direct way to smaller employers. Targets for people with disabilities, care leavers and veterans. And this is shared also with the last Minister for Skills, Robert Halfon, particularly was concerned about social mobility for apprenticeships. And I won't major on this, but there is a structural difficulty with social mobility and apprenticeships insofar as the employer has a vote on who the employer gives an apprenticeship to. And I want to feel dirigist here or you know, uncaring. When I was in I was Director of Training Education for the Armed Forces and head of apprenticeship recruitment for the Royal Air Force for some time. And I think the Armed Forces do more than most to induce and encourage social mobility for apprenticeship training. So largest employer of apprentices in the country, and a vehicle for social mobility. Also very keen to involve women and minority groups in apprenticeships, difficult to involve disabled people in the armed forces. But the fundamental thing, social mobility and inclusion was a byproduct of recruiting the people we wanted to do the job through aptitude and ability and attitude to serve in the jobs that they will be required to be serving in. It's very difficult to make social mobility or social inclusion the first task of an apprenticeship scheme, because the employer has a vote on whom they select to become apprentices. And the people they select to be apprentices are the ones they feel are most likely to add to their skills base and be most successful in the workplace. Employers might take an enlightened view to say that they want to actually have a workforce of the most diverse workforce they can and base selection on potential rather than previous achievement. But at the end of the day, most employers will want to employ somebody who will be successful in the job. They will not do it for social mobility reasons or social inclusion outrightly, which makes it slightly different to some other forms of education. And I mentioned about incentives for employers. HE, actually, pretty much all there is in the manifesto is no tuition fees. All those other conditionality around schools and FE, but the thing that got the most attention in the manifesto, in the National Education Service, was no tuition fees. But it says remarkably little about what conditions will apply to universities as a consequence, or in terms of how they'll be managed, how they'll ensure they're delivering the public good, how they'll be accountable, compared to other stages in education. The Charter is interesting. I'll go through it. I won't go through all of these, but it's worth looking at. It's relatively late out of in publication. But you can see how it picks up on those first ones about I was saying about the common good, isn't being a public good. There's an issue about integrating the National Education Service with other services in order to achieve the best outcomes. Tackling barriers to learning. All forms of education deserve respect, not deserve a respect, is about technical education being valued as highly as academic education. Accountable to public communities, parents and children, I think is a significant one, and higher standards of excellence, professionalism and so on. The accountable one is interesting, I think, because again, my point Schools, colleges and other public institutions within the National Education Service should be accountable to public communities, parents and children. It makes no reference to universities being accountable to communities, the public, parents or their students. I'm sure that's implied, but it's interesting that much of the National Education Service's direct and detailed provisions refer to all education but higher education, which again is ironic insofar as most people would associate Labour's education policy with no tuition fees in higher education. So kind of just teasing out now some of the positives from this, to salute and celebrate the fact that someone's looking at our education from an end-to-end perspective and trying to understand that making a change here might have a consequence further down the chain, and seeing it a cradle to grave sense, I think is heartening and helpful. I think it sometimes perhaps underestimates the complexity there will be in trying to manage a whole system, and trying to do that in terms of the way in which it's coordinated across an end-to-end system. It redresses imbalances between particular stages of education, which I like and I think is a sensible and proper thing to do. The tone is very much more positive, and I think has been well received, particularly by the teaching unions, by the heads of institutions and those involved in the delivery of education. It's very much more an emphasis upon professionalism, trusting professionals, and kind of indicates that in putting the various proposals together, the Labour Party has been listening to all who have been talking to them about the concerns they have about current education policy. But my I think is perhaps relevant here. I used to run a lobbying organisation, and when I read through it, I can almost read, and I could tell you who asked for that bullet to be put in and why, and what that appeals to, and who that appeals to, and who that appeals to. And it's almost got a feel sometimes about what can we say to keep them happy, and where's their concern, and what can we do about this, and what can we do about that. The sense, therefore, that that it does have a feel of being influenced in a way that was helpful in terms of listening, but tries to be all things to all people and potentially avoids some difficult choices that might need to be made in terms of what you can do and how you can do it and when you can do it. All the commentators have commented on affordability. I'll nail my colours to the mast here. Despite the views of others and at the risk of being marched out here by students, I don't believe free tuition fees is a good idea. There's a lot of analysis being done here about this in the Centre for Global Higher Education, comparing our system to others. There are some things that are wrong with our tuition fees system, which I'll come back to in a moment, but it is progressive. It has enabled widening participation. It is difficult from my perspective to see how you can have a mass higher education system that's funded adequately based simply on direct funding from government. I was fortunate to be the first from my family to go to university in the 1970s. I was that person who went for a working class background, who had a maintenance grant, free accommodation, and didn't pay tuition fees. But the participation rate at that time was somewhere around 20%. When you move north of 50%, funding that mass participation system in a way which is with adequate funding in order to allow universities to deliver high quality teaching and a good amount of contact time, is difficult for me to see how that would be achieved. Whilst education is a collective good, it's also a private good, and I think the individual stands to benefit directly and should make a contribution in that regard. My concern, which you might say is based on FE paranoia, is that in order to fund mass higher education adequately, in order to allow those institutions to deliver high quality and world-class standards, other forms of education will be crowded out. My object lesson in that, I would argue, and people in Scotland will tell me it wasn't quite like that, but the Scottish decision not to have tuition fees was coincident with a very substantial reduction in funding for further education courses and a reduction in the number of young people going and older people going to Scottish further education colleges. If I was being cynical and sensationalist, I could argue that poor young people in the Gorbals were paying the price of middle-class children going to St Andrews at no cost to the individuals. And that kind of equation stands to be made. Now, the Labour Party's National Education Service would imply that's not going to be done, because they're talking about funding adult education through life to be free at the point of use in the same way as the NHS. But how you reconcile the costs of a high, mass higher education system with a through life entitlement to education, to skill, re-skill, with a high quality apprenticeship service based on a levy which can only be increased by stages, and a 16 to 18 education system that's funded as highly as a 11 to 16, an 11 to 16 system which is funded at a national funding formula which must involve significant uplifts from current funding, and an early years entitlement which is substantially greater than it is now, can only be resolved, I think, with significant additional taxation or savings elsewhere within government expenditure. And I find it difficult to see how all of those can be bought out by a 2% increase in corporation tax. My analysis might have missed other identified forms of funding for a national education service, but I'm not seeing any from what I've looked at during the day-to-day. But, of particular interest to me here is actually something arising from the comments about accountability. For all its failings, the marketised system we have now, particularly in further education, allows for a good deal of institutional autonomy and responsiveness. And therefore, in a very complex labour market and a very complex modern economic system, institutions can respond with a degree of freedom, perhaps with more substantially less funding than they actually feel they need, but they are able to respond and make decisions about the shape of their provision in meeting the needs of local communities, students and employers in those areas. The interesting point there is, can you tell me who said those two things? The first one is from the introductory point in Jeremy Corbyn's speech. The second one is in the introduction by the Prime Minister to the Industrial Strategy 2 weeks ago. There isn't that much difference between the two. What both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are talking about is a more interventionist state, and in some of the things I've written, I've called this a post-market approach. And if those are interested, there's a really great book out by a guy called Haskell, and I can't remember the second name of the author, called Capitalism Without Capital, where they begin to identify the increase in intangible assets as opposed to tangible assets within leading economies, most particularly the US and the UK, which is underwrites some of the problems we're having with globalization, leads to in unevenness about economic benefit as between areas of the country, in companies that are difficult to tax and actually make a contribution to wider society. It leads to an emphasis upon benefiting from high-level technical education, but there are or higher level educational levels, and people in that group benefit while there is almost, Marx and Engels would have called a lumpen proletariat that stand to get left behind. The conclusion from the authors, which underwrites this, is that the market will not overcome these new structural changes within a modern economy in a capitalist system without capital and fixed assets. Consequently, this underwrites, and some of these are seen as the effects of globalization in places like Tilbury or in the US, about this feeling of people being left behind. The state will have to be more interventionist in order to facilitate investment in certain parts of the country, engender innovation, spread the benefits of a high-tech economy, and seek to actually deliver that more evenness of outcome. That's shared in the analysis in both the industrial strategy and in terms of the National Education Service proposed by Labour. But whilst we talk about an interventionist state, my concern is actually, if I'm looking at some of the comments by Jeremy Corbyn, particularly at the AOC conference, is seeing it as a return to a control approach. It's a matter of degree. We had a plan-led economy in the 1950s, 60s. The economy was a lot less complex, and this whole issue about intangible assets hadn't developed. We moved to a marketized system. It was never quite as marketized as people imply. That's failing in the face of globalization and these other influences. Just to return now back to a tightly controlled and directed system, I think will fail because the world has moved on in the intervening period. So if we're going to have a more interventionist state, we need to think about how it intervenes, where it intervenes, and to what degree, and with what outcomes. Which comes back to this accountability and autonomy part about you could run a system now that colleges and schools are much less autonomous and much more accountable in a direct and detailed way to local authorities and or the national level. Whether or not those local authorities and organisations are capable of keeping up with developments and running those institutions now in that direct control way, I suspect not. And they become more the facilitators of cooperation and collaboration rather than the drivers of detailed action. But we have to see whether or not people can move to this new kind of interventionist state. There's a lot within the National Education Service and actually also increasing amounts in the industrial strategy and government policy about institutions, particularly colleges, having to collaborate and cooperate one with another and also with other stakeholders locally. There's little about saying about how you incentivize collaboration in a system that's been very competitive for at least the last 20 years and the types of behaviours that will induce and how that will change. There's also, interestingly, in a national education service, how you resolve the tension between the local and the national. How you might have national standards, national funding rates, but then how do you have local determination? What level of power is devolved to the local area, and what's the settlement between national and local in this? It's, again, an issue that's facing this current government with the new mayors and the devolution of the adult education budget, which is because of the cuts is a relatively small part of the education budget, but what the mayors will do with that will be different in one city to another. So how you can have equality of outcomes between different areas when you have local determinations, I think is a general issue about devolution to cities up and down the country and local areas. And I think it's something that needs to be worked through in terms of the National Education Service. John, I hope that was what you were looking for as an introduction. It was a pleasure actually for you asked me to look at it because I hadn't looked at it properly, and I think I've probably still got more to learn about it.
Well, that was terrific.